I'm sure that for many of you, if not all of you, with a little encouragement, you could come to the microphone and share with us of some of the God moments in your own life. Those moments when you've known the truth that God has engaged with you. That God is with you in that particular circumstance at that time. Or that God has called you and spoken to you and you've got a compulsion that when you check it out, it constantly gets reaffirmed and affirmed and you know that you're going to comply. I'm sure each of you, if not each of you, then most of you would come and do that with some encouragement. And if I was in Papua New Guinea Highlands at about this point, I'd probably just move out of the pulpit and go and sit down over there and we'd be here till 3, 4 or 5 o'clock this afternoon. Because you get up and you take your turn and you come and you start sharing what God has done in your life. But we're Palangis, we're Australians, and we're very English shaped, and we don't do that, do we? But I know you do, and you can, because I've sat in probably, 40 homes so far that I've been among you. I'm still coming if I haven't got to your place, if I may. And slowly as you share your stories and your life journeys, these God moments appear. Maybe it's because I'm there and that it directs something of what you're going to say. But they're precious, precious experiences. You're telling and sharing. And you might say, well, when Ian and Margaret left or whatever, we just got talking about things, but they weren't just talking about things, they were very significant things. And I appreciate that and value that, and that's the role of a pastor to have that privilege, I guess. But thank you for your witness, your sharing. And I want to spark that and keep that alive in you and hear more of it. But the other thing about that I feel I must say about those God moments is that you tend to think that they might be the good moments in your lives and the wonderful things that happen and the way in which you had these rich experiences as a result of that period, that time, that moment of God engaging with you. However, that's not been the whole story, has it? I've heard your pain and those times when you are stressed or alone or bereaved or one bereavement after the other. And those times sort of rip you of your normality and yet you dare to share and to talk about those times. And then you'll tell me that your faith was what got you through. And then you realise that God was with you in those difficult times and sustained you, took you on. Did you hear in that reading before words that went something like one negative after the other? They press ganged this guy to carry the cross and they took him to the place of the skull and the gruesome stuff continued. And Jesus gave up a loud cry and died. And there was an earth. The tough times, the difficult times are times that prove grace is the most powerful emotion in life. There was a guy introduced into that narrative in Mark 15. Remember, Mark's written in the church in Rome. And the guy was introduced as Simon or Simeon, depends on what that extra vowel's there for, to make it pronounce the I and make it long. So if you don't know, Simon is meant to be Simon, and you go into another language and it looks like Simon. It's a bit like, Taboon or Tubu or something or other. You get into that kind of corner of language and you discover that this Simon is actually the one that's called by Luke Simeon because he's working in the Greek. But this is a story that the Roman Church knows, because, as Mark tells it, he puts a little bit in parenthesis. There's a bracket in there that says, oh, by the way, he was the father of Alexander and Rufus. End of bracket. In other words, the audience, the immediate audience, knew those guys. Now we were back in Jerusalem, now we're in Rome. And if you want to check it out, you go to the last chapter of Romans and find Paul writing his great thanksgiving of all the people that have blessed him and that he wants to send greetings to before he was executed. And you find in verse 13, he writes, does anybody know? And I send greetings to Rufus and his mother also, who was a mother to me. Whoa. So we were back in Jerusalem, we're back in Jerusalem, and this guy who was nicknamed Black Man or Niger, a black man, gets to carry the cross. A man of colour. He'd come from Cyrene. And if he's a man of colour in Cyrene, then he's come from the Upper Nile, from Nubia, or places beyond, or his ancestor before him did. And therefore they were press ganged and carried as slaves into what is today Libya. So we've got a former slave coming to Jerusalem for the Passover. And in the text there, talking to the Roman Church, he came in from the country. He was on pilgrimage. Why do slaves or former slaves end up joining in with Judaism and going to Jerusalem for Passover? Because they learned that God was the God who set slaves free. And Passover was the celebration of that freedom that God gave to his people when he led them out of Egypt and out of slavery, because God had heard their cries, he knew their suffering, and he called Moses to call them out, bring them out, and tell the persecutors to let them go. So you can understand that all the plethora of gods that were available in all the chatter in that world, there was one God that stood out, and that was the God who set slaves free. Now that is politically subversive. In a world that depended on slavery, this is an undercurrent that's pulling the mat out from under it. And a former slave, together with his wife and 2 children that they knew in the church in Rome, end up, as they came in that very morning, arriving, finally having made a commitment that if you set me free, God, I will go and honour that and worship you. I will be part of a pilgrimage, ultimately, to Jerusalem. And then there's an amazing moment. Just as they arrive, the police or the guard or the soldier looks around and says, oh, who is powerless around here and who's big enough to carry the cross? Oh, you here, get out and carry this cross. You know the way it is. You pick on the powerless who in this case happened to have enough strength to carry the cross. Well, you wouldn't pick out him because he'd squawk and he'd be in court before you knew where, and there'd be an insurrection. But no, you grab this guy. And Paul later writes about the hospitality of that family. That this bad guy's wife was a mother to him also. This is reconciliation at the top of the tree. And we would understand, I think it's not specified in the scriptures, but we understand and know that Paul and that family were together in Antioch. Luke tells us that in Acts. And so there in Antioch, where Paul was brought to be the teacher of this early persecuted Christian community, all the people that people like Paul had driven out and hunted and tried to arrest because they believed in the resurrection, and taking them in chains to Jerusalem to have them stoned or abused. Somehow or other these people have fled and found company in Antioch, and that's the first church to be called Christian in our history. And there in that church is this black man who finally gets to lay his hands on Paul when he commissions Paul and Barnabas to go on their first missionary journey. And when Barnabas leaves, then the structures in the local church arise, and these guys become leaders in that church. And later on you find at the end of Paul's life, he's very, very grateful, and he sends greetings to my mother in the Lord and to her son Rufus, who become a mate of mine. In all of those sorts of life journeys, how many God moments were there, and how do you reflect on your life and look back and say, wow, God has been with me through all of that? You see, sometimes, like this guy, it's not what you suffer, it's the way it impacts other people and becomes part of changing history when we're prepared to identify with those who are wounded and broken. When we listen and understand each other's story and realise in all of that the best of all is Emmanuel. God is with us. For those of you who are at home listening to this, we want you to know that even in your homes, there where you are, that the best news is that God is with you. And for Simon out at Point, Vernon, and all the others that are listening to this, just know that whatever life deals, that the underwriting of God is his faithfulness, and you're never alone. The other narrative that you were hearing in Mark's Gospel was this transfiguration. The God moment. Powerful revelationary moment. And these God moments are not just callings, they're not just comforts, sometimes they're deep revelations. And you come to understand God in another way. I'm a little tired of hearing the expression around, I don't have to worry about COVID, God's in control. Well, if God is in control, then the control is that he's called us to make a difference in this world and to end our selfishness and to engage and to care for others and respond to others. Be careful with your glib God's in control of it. I know it might be an expression of your faith, but let your faith deepen and come and realise that you're gripped by that faith. And we're called to be evidence together of God's love breaking into this world. There are also in this powerful calling of that transfiguration, not only a remarkable revelation of who God is, for there is God standing in all humanity, made in our image on the top of a mountain. But there was also a powerful cancellation going on. Sometimes God moments are moments of cancellation when we have to change. Did you notice there are only two characters beside Jesus that appeared momentarily for these guys? One was Elijah, the representative of the prophets, and the other one was Moses, the representative of the law. And if you understand your Hebrew scriptures and the Old Testament and the culture of literature there are three parts to the Old Testament, and one of them is left out. There's the Torah, the law part, represented by Moses. And there's the prophet part, all the prophets challenging and correcting their culture constantly and announcing marvellous things, like you heard in Jacinta's choice of music before, that God is Emmanuel. And He's with us in the most wounded of times, and you can sing God's songs in a strange land when you're in exile, for He's still with you. And Emmanuel is this powerful statement of the prophets. Isaiah, for example, where Isaiah says it's no longer a war cry, because there was a kingship period in between their literature period, the great period of King David, and all the other kings that became, like Saul and the others that followed him, Solomon, his son's son. That period, it didn't get represented on the mountain because King David didn't appear. And the militarism of King David period that led them into bigger and bigger enemies, generating enemy and enemy till they were big enough, because their warfare was so good that they created bigger enemies, till the enemies were so big they came and destroyed the nation and took them into exile. And suddenly you find in the transfiguration this commitment to militarism is cancelled. Now, this is politically dangerous, a very politically dangerous thesis. For this is written in Mark's Gospel in the midst of Rome. An embryonic church receiving this gospel in the midst of their persecution. And at a time when the emperorship was constantly changing, frequent changing of hands. And it's an apocalyptic passage. It's sort of something that says this will happen before the end of time. And here comes this remarkable fulfillment of God's promises, of God's reign, and of Emmanuel, that God is with us. And that changes the way we do the world, the way we live society. For Jesus appears there on the mountain as the ultimate lawgiver. And if you want to read the law, he says, well, it's about love, isn't it? To love your Lord, your God, with all your heart and your soul and your mind and even your strength. And to love those who are your neighbours as you would love yourself. Matthew takes that to the next step, of course, and quotes that Jesus also said, and your enemy. So this God moment of Jesus suddenly appearing with the disciples and the cloud that sort of symbolises this holy moment. There's a new truth here. And the whole church through its history has struggled or refused to even listen to it. There have been times when God needs to come and make some cancellations of the way we see ourselves. And you know that these God moments, whether it's that moment of suddenly being press-ganged and opening up a whole history that follows, until you come some generation later and discovered it brought the most powerful transformation, it brought the most beautiful reconciliations, as Paul writes to the people he persecuted and hunted, and they're running away and they offered him hospitality. And he calls them mum. You see, under all that darkness, there is this brilliance of love, of grace, of calling of God's presence who calls us into another world. And right in the midst of the war and after 10 years of violence and abuse in Bougainville, I had a team. It was my third team. I led the first one, and my wife was a member of the second team. And the third team went down to work in healing the nations, and they sent us to the most fractioned parts of Bougainville, down to the CY. Team 3, Team 4, and finally Team 5 got the shock of its life. It ended up in the headquarters of the BRA, the Bougainville Revolutionary Army. An amazing, amazing story, and now I haven't got the time to tell you, but amazing, amazing breakthroughs that were occurring through the weekend. Nobody planned it in expert. All they did was did what I sent them to do because I was told to send them. And then, in the midst of these marvellous, marvellous transformations, hours of weeping and crying and embracing one another and forgiving one another and embracing in their first Easter after we cracked the peace process. On the Sunday afternoon, the commander of the BRA, Ishmael Tarama, came down to talk to the guys and pull them aside. Some of you will know the names of some of these people. One was the Reverend Robert Hinks. The other one was the Reverend Dan Armstrong, and their wives and others in the team. And Ishmael came down with the little words and said, this big introvert, 10 years of commanding the army and doing all the operations, organising atrocities and so on. And he sits down beside the guys and he says sheepishly, I think God's been talking to me. What's God been saying to you? God said, Ishmael, I want you to disarm. War. A revolutionary army, they got all their weapons by killing others and capturing their weapons and all the other skullduggery that had to go on. Weapons were precious identity. And PNG still had its defence force on the island. Why would we disarm? Ishmael, I'd like you to disarm. Ishmael, 2.5 weeks later, was now back in Moresby for the continuity of the peace process under Moyavi. In Moyavi, it began the day with the representatives of both sides together to work through what this new agreement was going to be, had an agenda, and Ishmael, with a bigger team, said, we don't need that agenda today because the BRA want to disarm. I don't know how you get to a moment like that. I don't know how the PNG Defence Force could imagine that moment when the Bougainville said, we want to disarm. And we've got a 4-point plan. We want the certification of key holders who will have keys to the containers where we take and deposit the weapons. And we want agreement on the disposal of the weapons. And we want a United Nations observer mission to monitor the process. And all that was agreed to that day. And Ismail Farama was elected last year to be the new president-elect of Bougainville. And Ismail's ministry, as he was getting on the bus, now you've got to understand this, these are commanders of the BRA, these are rebels, these are fighting against Australia and its allies, against Papua New Guinea, Australian-trained defence forces. Our budget, military budget goes up there as well. And I invited him and his mates to come down to Sydney for training in peace building. And the miracle was the Australian High Commission gave them visas to come to Sydney. And the moment we were about to leave the college after 8 weeks, Ishmael was standing there, he was about to get on the bus, and I was taking him out to the airport with the other PNG contingents. And he came up to me and he put his fingers in my side and he went, I'm going to shoot you. And I looked at him eye to eye and I said, what for this time? We'd had 8 weeks together, he said. And he said, I came down here and I put on, because I'd asked him, what did you put on your visa application? What occupation did you put? Rebel commander and whatever you put. I didn't know how he got around that one, but he's put down farmer. He said, I came down here as a farmer, but you've shown me what a mess I've done and what a chaos I've created, and therefore how much work I've got to do for restoration and for forgiveness. Loaded with God moments all the way through. But then I think of the woman in the Lockyer Valley. A house was burnt down. And I took this issue to worship on Sunday morning and I said to them, we've got a house fire up here for a family that came from Victoria. They've got no family, no friends up here at all, and no support from home. It's our responsibility. This is happening in our stable. Something has been birthed here, and it's our task to deal with it. And so, after worship, one of the big farmers who thinks in $1 million deals, the chairman of the Australian Cotton Board, Cotton Foundation, Queensland Cotton Board and the Australian Cotton Foundation, came to me afterwards and said, well, on our farm we've got a vacant workers' cottage that's available for as long as you need it. And this began to happen as people came out and said, these are all the things we can offer. And then Jeanette, her first time ever in a church, came out with her 2 little boys because her mother-in-law had told her son to get out and leave her alone because there'd been another instance of domestic violence, and said to Jeanette, Jeanette, I can't come up, I can't help you, but you go and find a church and go to the closest church and they will look after you. And as she walked out, she said to me, Reverend, I haven't got anything to give. But I've got an empty lock-up garage And if that empty space is of any use, it's yours. People impacted by God can turn nothing into a miracle. And I said to one of my other guys, Trevor, get your truck. I've been dealing with your domestic violence. Now you're going to do the opposite. Get your truck, get down here tomorrow morning, and all the stuff that arrives goes into Jeanette's garage ASAP. And it did. And lives flowed and changed in that congregation and in that community. Because in that moment, first time in a church, Jeanette reflected later, I knew God spoke to me. I've got nothing to give, and she was giving me an apology. From the little to the big, from the horror of being captured as a slave to reconciliation, this is the power of the gospel. And I want you to understand that in that transfiguration moment, you come to understand that this was God's humanity, 100% divine, 100% human on that mountain. So the full divinity of God and the full humanity that we represent comes together again and again in our lives. And I want you to be electrified to the work of the Spirit in this congregation. May God strengthen you and bless you and meet you in every circumstance, whether you're at home listening to this or part of this congregation this morning. To finish our time of worship and send us out, I'd like you to share with the song that comes from the lips of a pregnant teenager who didn't have a husband. Her name was Mary, and she came to realise that God was working in her life in a remarkable way. And so we sing the Magnificat together. Tell out my soul, and let us take it with us. May God have his way with you, encountering you continually throughout your life in special moments and in deep experiences, ministering through you his grace to others. And so may you know that as you go, you are to be evidence of the love of God, and that is being experienced among you, because you know salvation through Christ and the work of his Spirit as he weaves you into a fellowship of his grace and empowers you for mission and ministry. Go then, knowing God is with you. Emmanuel.